What's up, guys? This is Mr. Eldridge, and in today's video, we're going to look at the economic policies during the 1960s and 1970s, specifically the Great Society and Stagflation. First, let's talk about the Great Society. There was an additional desire for progressive reformers of the New Left to help provide aid for people that were in poverty. As a general rule, the political left tends to highly value the idea of providing aid, support, or protection to the perceivably or historically disadvantaged through the state. These perceived disadvantaged groups include the old, sick, poor, women, minorities, or any group whom has been deemed as a mistreated group. As such, Lyndon Johnson pushed Congress to pass a series of laws that provided said state support that he called the Great Society. The Great Society focused on providing federal aid and support to the poor and old through programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, welfare programs, easier access to food stamps, and the expansion of Social Security. While the goal and the results of these programs are desirable and arguably positive, critics argue that these programs are expensive and are considered by the politically right as unfair tax hikes that increase the cost of production and therefore the price of consumer goods. With postmodern ideals certainly leading to incredibly positive and appropriate reforms to grant equal opportunity and protection to women, minorities, and other groups, some critics argued the movement, or at least the efforts of select radicals, went too far following into the 1970s. Programs such as affirmative action required a certain amount of ethnicity, most notably minorities. Proponents hail this as a necessary means to including disadvantaged groups in colleges and careers, arguing they would otherwise be denied employment or enrollment due to explicit or implicit biases against them. Opponents, on the other hand, claim such policies are inherently racist and require considerations that are predominantly or solely based on race rather than the merits or abilities of the person in question. Such heavy involvement by the federal government in the individual lives and incomes of Americans through the Great Society and affirmative action programs resulted in a significant amount of opposition from more conservative Americans in the late 1970s and leading into a resurgence of conservatism in the 1980s. During the 1970s, an expected set of economic problems surfaced. What was particularly unique about these set of problems was that, unlike the deflation and predictable unemployment of the Great Depression, the 1970s saw an unusual combination of inflation accompanied with unemployment. This is known as stagflation, where you have a stagnant economy, you have a decrease in economic growth, and you have rising inflation. With the causes and possibly remedies for the Great Depression were quite clear, the same could not be said of stagflation. Stagflation was a far more nuanced development that required years of analysis to decipher. Usually when prices increased at reasonable rates, so too did wages and employment, but this wasn't happening. Wages remained flat and unemployment grew. Several factors contributed to this phenomenon. Most notable of these factors was the massive influx of workers as millions of women, minorities, immigrants, and baby boomers entered the job market. This created a surplus of workers, which meant that, generally speaking, employees were unable to negotiate for higher wages. With millions of women, minority groups, immigrants, etc., ready to fill jobs, employers could hire cheap labor at will, which kept wages low. While the inclusion of these groups would pay off tremendously, bringing in intelligent, creative, and motivated individuals, it was an unanticipated and temporary negative consequence. Another factor that raised prices in the 1970s was a sharp rise in oil, and therefore a rise in the costs of production and prices for Western goods. With the oil embargo in 1973, this was an embargo by Middle Eastern Muslim states against the West for their support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The costs of production for Western businesses increased as power and transportation, both independent on oil, rose substantially with the increase of oil prices. Great Society programs, as beneficial as they are in most cases, also drained the federal government of its financial resources, resulting in increased taxes and increased cost of production in the West. Lastly, much like the Great Society programs, environmental regulations, as beneficial as they are in many cases, rose production costs and prices as companies were forced to pay for proper sanitation, recycling, and other required services. All of these factors combined for a very difficult transition, suffering stagnant wages and rising inflation in the interim. After a decade or so, the problem would sort itself out as more jobs were created, increased interest rates, decreased spending to reduce prices, and wages recovered. Regardless, it was difficult for wage earners in the 1970s. Thank you so much for paying attention to this video. If you have not subscribed to this channel, please go ahead and do so now. Thank you so much, and you have a great day.